welcome you to today's lecture. We are delighted to have invited Professor Jason Moore to speak with us today on the topic of Anthropocene or Capitalocene, climate, power, and capital in the making of planetary crisis. And we are honored to have Professor Zhou Shuqing as a moderator for today's conversation. Professor Moore will speak about 50 to 55 minutes, followed by a general discussion. I will serve as your translator for the general discussion. Please be noted that today's talk will be recorded, so please wait for the microphone when you ask questions. So now I'm gonna give the microphone to our moderator, Professor Zhou Shuqing. Thank you.
Professor Moore and our distinguished guests, good afternoon. On behalf of Research Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences, I would like to express our sincere appreciation for your acceptance of our invitation. We are actually taking advantage of Professor Moore's academic trip to China. But this side trip back to Taiwan, I think will provide him an opportunity to meet new friends and old friends. And I hope Professor Moore would enjoy it. As you have already seen from our flyer, Professor Jason Moore is a professor of sociology at Binghamton University. But he claims himself as an environmental historian and historical geographer. And he actually has a degree from geography. We are in the same field. And that's why I'm so honored to be assigned by our director, Professor Yanfen Zheng, over there, as the moderator for this talk. And Professor Moore is an author or editor for several widely recognized books, such as Capitalism in the Web of Life, Anthropocene or Capitalocene, Natural History and the Crisis of Capitalism, Capitalocene or Anthropocene, and also A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. I recognize some of it has Chinese version, and some, yes, and I know some colleagues also have his book. So feel free after our talk to get his signature. And he also received many distinguished prizes, including the Alice Hamilton Prize of the American Society for Environmental History, the Distinguished Scholarship Award for the section on the political economy of the world system, and the Byers and Bernstein Prize in Agrarian Change. So you can see his academic influence and outreach. His influence is interdisciplinary. His talk today, I think Yi has already mentioned, so I don't have to repeat again. And let's use our warm applause to welcome him, please.
Thank you very much. You will have to forgive me. I am overcoming a cold, but I am very excited to be here. Thank you very much for those kind introductory remarks. And this is really a talk, a lecture that asks, what if this representation, this imagination of the environmental problem is itself part of the problem, part of the apparatus of capital accumulation and of world domination that is driving all of us on this planet towards hothouse Earth. This is the famous, iconic Earthrise photograph taken in 1968. What if this imaginary is part of the problem? This was not an invention of 1968. The globe was an invention of the rise of capitalism. Indeed, our earliest surviving globe comes from 1492. So the idea of the whole Earth and the idea of the planetary has been a product of conquest and an instrument of conquest and domination. Now that's important because as we enter into an era of unprecedented climate crisis that is unprecedented over the past 12,000 years or so, we are confronting a reality in which questions of greenhouse gas concentrations and questions of power and capital accumulation are entangling and interpenetrating as never before. So this marks the Holocene, and you can see that what characterizes the Holocene, a geological era of about 12,000 years, is unusual climatic stability. The Holocene is now over, and what I want to be suggesting throughout this talk is that the climate change, the end of the Holocene, is not just a state shift. That's the language of Earth system scientists. It's not just a state shift, a fundamental, rapid, and irreversible transition in the climate system as a geophysical process. It is also a state shift in capitalism, and it demands an intellectual state shift that goes beyond the idea that reality can be contained within two great boxes, one called nature, that is ecologies without humans, and humans and humanity or civilization over here, that is humans without ecologies. This is the idea of human exceptionalism, the idea that humans alone are exempt from the interdependencies of the web of life, and it is also a category of social power. Pardon me. It is a category of empire and an instrument of exclusion of many human beings, not least indigenous peoples and many others, as we shall see. Pardon me, you'll have to bear with me as I cough. I just came back from Beijing as well, so I am experiencing the state shift of the climate and capitalism as well. So really, our big question is, how do we move beyond the billiard ball model of man and nature crashing into each other? And what I'll underline throughout this talk is that this is a double problem. It is simultaneously an analytical problem in that it obscures the bigger picture and the bigger web of relations that drive historical change. And it is a question of actually existing cultural domination in which many human beings were expelled from membership in humanity. So this is the dominant model. This is the model of the Anthropocene, but this is also the model of much work in environmental social science that is now increasingly coming under criticism for good reasons. Now, this is not a bad place to begin, but it is a poor place to end up. This is what I call green arithmetic. Nature plus human systems adds up to the whole picture. And what I want to suggest is that that does not add up at all to the picture, and that human systems are within the web of life at every turn. The great environmental historian and feminist Marxist Carolyn Merchant reminded us nearly 3 decades ago that we can conceptualize great shifts within civilization or changes in modes of production through interconnected and interpenetrated transformations of the web of life, of the reproduction of extra-human nature and of human nature, production systems, and ideas of nature, not as separate realities, but as interconnected, interpenetrated realities at every turn. This is the critique and the alternative to green arithmetic, society plus nature. So the conversation that I have been part of and that I have been working with many other wonderful scholars around the world is what I would call world ecology. Not the ecology of the world, but a way of understanding how capitalism, and for that matter, other civilizations, as we shall see, emerged through the web of life. This is a co-productive dynamic in which capitalism, which is itself a way of organizing nature, is itself organized by webs of life. including, as we know, climate change. So this is one way to begin to understand what I would call climate change as geophysical process. And this comes out of a range of experiences, but we know in geography that geography has been split, as is anthropology, between physical and social moments. And that has to end if we are going to deal with the climate crisis. We have to incorporate the geophysical, but we have to move towards the geohistorical. So the geohistorical incorporates the active movements, in this case of climate change. This is a proxy for great moments of climate change in the Northern Hemisphere over the past 2,000 years. And one thing immediately jumps out. Every time the climate changes, there are major shifts in civilizational power, and civilizations come to an end, or they restructure in dramatic fashion. This is a very Eurocentric annotation here for reasons that have to do with my concern about the rise of capitalism in the long 16th century. But what you can see is that every time the climate shifts, there are a range of transformations that induce fundamental crises in the civilizations in question, from the crisis of Rome and feudalism all the way into the history of capitalism, as we shall see. So what this means is that each of these is an ecological revolution in Carolyn Merchant's sense of the term. It recognizes that social power, modes of production, markets, and all the rest that we usually characterize as social are at every turn bundled and interpenetrated with and within webs of life, and that ideas of nature matter in this. Of course, the idea of nature as separate from humanity is a thoroughly European invention, which gives no credit at all to Europeans, but is rather an instrument of conquest and domination, because it allowed European powers, as I'll point out in a few minutes, to reclassify all the humans they met in lands that were designated colonies. All the humans could be called savages, wild, and outside of civilization. Therefore, they had to be dominated and they had to be civilized. To be civilized is like to be developed, right? It is a process of domination and extraction. This also gives us a way to move beyond man versus nature. The great turning points in world history are not Malthusian crises. They're not crises of overpopulation. And furthermore, they are not moments of collapse in the catastrophist narrative that we have received from people like Jared Diamond. Indeed, when civilizations enter into great crises, what collapses is the apparatus of class domination, and so the great majority tend to do better. So we're going to come back to those world historical questions in just a moment. But the alternative to man and nature, or nature plus society, is what I would call world ecology. That this insists that questions of power and domination, production and reproduction, are always with and within the web of life. Capitalism is a world ecology within the biosphere, but with a porous and permeable membrane that is always dependent on movements to the frontiers of what are, in the eyes of capital and empire, uncivilized life. And this asks us to take seriously Marx's insights on ecology. Ecology not just as nature. In fact, Marx refuses the modernist conception of nature to show that capitalism develops the exhaustion and the degradation simultaneously of the soil and the worker. Not the soil and the worker, but the soil and the worker, of the worker on the soil, of the land in the worker. And the second passage here, you don't need to read it all, but the bottom the last sentence here is very important. What he is doing here in introducing the question of the labor process in capital, and this begins his discussion of the labor process, which, as you can imagine, for Marx is fundamental, that for Marx, work is a simultaneous transformation of the relations between humans and the environment, and of the totality of humans and humans and humans and nature. That it is a process through which, in acting upon what he calls external nature, the worker is transformed in the process. That is, the worker makes environments, and the environments make the worker. That, of course, applies not just to the labor process in some generality, but to the history of civilizations. The ways that civilizations organize landscapes, organize resources, organize power, organize water, organize all of this is a dialectical process of environment making. So civilizations make environments, environments make civilizations, which means that the question of class and domination and systems of production and social reproduction, like family life and education, are fundamental. So we've talked about something called the Anthropocene, the age of man. And I will underscore there are, in fact, two Anthropocenes. One is the geological Anthropocene, and this identifies the so-called golden spikes in the geological record that would be apparent to observers millions of years from now. They are three. One is the residues from nuclear testing, another are chicken bones, and another are the accumulations of plastic in the biosphere. What a wonderful legacy modernity will leave to living beings millions of years from now. But there's another Anthropocene, and it is what I call the popular Anthropocene. And this returns to an older discourse on man and nature, which is has been an instrument of domination, of racism and sexism in the interests of pursuing cheap natures, so that the very expensive system of capitalism, a system of endless capital accumulation, can continue to grind the life out of the planet, including all of us here. So this is Anthropocene, the popular Anthropocene, as a grand distraction and a grand effort to say on the part of the world's billionaires and financial markets that we are all in this together. We all did this. So we want to be very careful when we think about these kinds of claims. This is the popular Anthropocene. And the danger of the popular Anthropocene of asserting man versus nature is manifold, but one of them is that it short circuits the kinds of conversations that we need to actually make sense of the climate crisis as something more than rapidly escalating concentrations of greenhouse gas molecules in the atmosphere. We also need to challenge the conceit and the utter audacity of advocates of the Anthropocene, the popular Anthropocene, that this is anthropogenic, made by all humans, right? Well, no, indeed. And the disparity is even greater than this chart suggests, since the overwhelming bulk of China's CO2 emissions derive from foreign direct investment emanating in the Euro-American core and sending exports to the Euro-American core, so that countries like Sweden or the United States can claim that they are reducing their carbon intensity. It hides the process. So the alternative, again, is that we look at the dialectics of environment making in two registers. One is a world historical process. So I've emphasized this several times, that capitalism makes environments, environments make capitalism. This is very clear in the present moment, that climate change is an absolute disaster for capitalist business as usual, that the climate changes that are produced by capitalist forces that is capital-ogenic, made by capital climate change, is now entering directly into suppressing some of the core elements of the capitalist model that has existed for 5 centuries, not least the agricultural productivity model that originated in the sugar plantations of the Atlantic and in the Dutch Republic and English countrysides of the 16th century. That model of producing more and more food with less and less labor power is directly and immediately undermined by climate change. But this is also obscured, that the division of the world into man and nature, or civilization and nature, as people talked about it for a very, very long time, obscured the fundamental class relation, which was experienced as a process of colonial, racial, and gender domination by most of the world, that most humans were in the rise of capitalism, and even so today are not part of civilization in the eyes of capital and the powerful states of the world. Peasants, for instance, are routinely dismissed as somehow uneducated, uncivilized. If only they understood what needed to be done, then the problems of the world could be resolved. So there's this line of what was called in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries civility and savagery. That is civilization and nature. And what this crude map shows you is that it was only within Europe that society existed. The Irish were not part of it. Women everywhere were not part of it. They were, in Federici's language, the savages of Europe. And in the across the Americas, and of course in sub-Saharan Africa, they were savages everywhere. In Peru, the Spanish called indigenous peoples naturales, that is, part of nature. So again, we return to the representation of the world as a globe and looking at it from the outside. This is what Donna Haraway calls the God trick. When Haraway said this, she didn't mean we shouldn't think big. Many people took it to mean that. She meant we shouldn't pretend that we are external observers to a reality of the globe that is unproblematic, that is exempt from relations of power. This is a map of world power. And one could only conquer the globe. One could only conquer the globe by imagining and representing the globe. One could only develop the techniques of modern mapping in order to secure the cheap natures, including labor, food, energy, and raw materials necessary to make an extraordinarily wasteful, inefficient, and violent system that we call capitalism work. So let's come back to the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is fundamentally an anti-politics machine, to borrow from Jim Ferguson in a different context of talking about development politics. The Anthropocene is an anti-politics machine. It wants to find solutions that it presents as technological and say that these are technical solutions like geoengineering without dealing with the politics of it. Here I quote Andrew Refkin. But we can look at the Earth system discourse on the Anthropocene, which overwhelmingly presents the problem as a technical problem. The Anthropocene discourse has no interest, no serious interest in decarbonizing the atmosphere through democratization. So as I mentioned, the popular Anthropocene disables a radical, just, and democratic response to the climate crisis. It reduces the problem of climate crisis to greenhouse gas molecules. But that's a problem because it's not a problem solely of greenhouse gas molecules. If it was, we would solve it because it is not an insuperable technical barrier. It is a political barrier. And the Capitalocene argument does not argue with the geological Anthropocene. It argues with the popular Anthropocene, and it says in order to engage analytically and politically with the climate crisis at the end of the Holocene, we have to understand this moment as a moment of the climate class divide, of climate patriarchy, of climate apartheid. These are fundamental and irreducible moments of the climate crisis. So again, we go back to the geohistorical perspective, that moments of climate crisis are moments of geohistorical crisis. So moments of climate change over the past 2,000 years are moments of geohistorical crises. And that is important because it introduces a crucial idea. That is that moments of climate change are moments of political crisis for the rulers and are moments of political possibility for all of us here. Now we can go, I'm going to take you on a very, very rapid tour here in about 5 or 6 minutes of about 1,000 years or so of world history. The fall of Rome comes at precisely the moment when the climate era that was named after the Romans, the Roman climate optimum, comes to an end. It comes to an end right around the middle of the 2nd century and then turns dramatically worse by the year 400. Beginning in the 350s, there was the worst drought in Eurasia in the past 2,000 years, and this pushed the so-called barbarian peoples into the Roman Empire. Now, the fall of Rome is not all about barbarians, to be sure, but this was one crucial climate-related moment of the crisis of Roman political economy. And we used to call this era that followed from about the year 400, the Dark Ages. And I'm going to tell you it was anything but. The collapse of Roman power in Western and Central Europe after the year 400, 476 is usually the conventional date, but one can quibble with that. That what happened was that across Western and Central Europe, peasants took command of production, of social life. They reorganized their lives into villages, which had been largely destroyed under Roman hegemony and the system of large agricultural estates. Gender relations improved. The fertility regime changed dramatically. The health of children improved dramatically. That it appears by many indicators that under a peasant regime of agriculture and fertility, in which the power of aristocrats almost everywhere was significantly compromised, that peasants could reestablish relations of life-making that allowed them to live through some of the coldest decades of the past 2,000 years, a period called the Late Antique Little Ice Age. And I'm not going to walk you through all the elements of this, but I'm going to say this, that the collapse of Roman power meant the collapse of Rome's 1%. And when the 1% are taken out of the picture, everyone else lives better. So let's take that to heart in the present moment, that we have 8 human beings in the world, billionaires, who own more wealth than the bottom 3.6 billion people, half the Earth's population. So if the billionaires are taken out of the picture, everyone else lives better. Is it more complicated than that? Yeah. To make a long story short, when the climate improved, there were possibilities for the resurgence of aristocratic power and their organization of agricultural production into monocultures and their reassertion of power over the peasantry. Peasants lived much worse, but the lords prospered. Pardon me. This was during what is called, for Europe, the medieval warm period. As you can see, by the year 1300, the warm period turns to a little ice age. So again, just as the late antique little ice age coincides with the collapse of Roman power in the West in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, or 5th, 6th, rather the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, we also have a moment of climate change coming coinciding with civilizational crisis. So in late medieval Europe, in 14th century Europe, this was not a moment of too many people on too little land. This is the textbook story. It is a Malthusian story. It is entirely 100% incorrect. True, there were many people on the land, but that doesn't tell you anything. What matters are the relations of power and the organization of production on the land. Now, the feudal lords were unwilling to adjust their agricultural model, and the result was famine, disease, and then revolt. And we can draw a parallel to the present moment, where we are living through a now 3 decades long stagnation of the Green Revolution agricultural model. There has been no great leap forward in agricultural productivity, indeed quite the opposite on a world scale. The productivity growth continues to slow, in part because of climate, but in part, as we know about anti-globalization movements, that at the center of the crisis of neoliberal globalization was the battle over agriculture, and the space opened for various peasant and farmer movements around the world in an era today of climate change. So there are clear parallels to be drawn. So to make that the crisis of feudalism that ensued was a crisis of feudal business as usual. Feudalism could not be restored, not because of the climate, not because of disease, not because of population, but because of the peasantry's class power. Thank you very much. And so the result was that the living standards for the vast majority again improved. There was a historic defeat of feudalism's ruling classes in Central and Western Europe during the 14th century. That's why they end up looking abroad, looking to the great frontier, looking to the Americas to begin to find a solution to a big problem for lordly power, for the power of territorial states and the wealth of the bankers. They could not reduce the wages of the laboring classes for this extended period. So we can ask these questions. How do we understand that climate is not everything, but climate is in everything? In other words, how do we have not a climate determinism, but climate as one determination in rich totalities of historical change? And here is just a very short list of climate changes over the past few centuries related to fundamental changes in civilizations across Eurasia. So this sounds banal, but in an era where it is often said it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, let's refuse that conceit. It's a real feeling that people have, a real belief that people have. But civilizations have lives. They're born, they develop, they die. And very, very rarely, there's one exception, which I'll talk about in a moment, but they do not, civilizations in the form that they have developed in one climate era do not live into another climate era. That is, ruling classes do not survive eras of climate change. And let's remember, over the past 2,000 years, in the Holocene, we are talking about an era of relative climate stability. As we move into the 21st century, we will see increasing volatility and instability in the world climate system. So these geohistorical crises, a crisis of civilization is not the end of the world. Indeed, capitalism has been the end of the world for many human beings across the past 5 centuries, especially indigenous peoples. But rather, crises are moments of change and destabilization for ruling classes, that a crisis is not a collapse of social life, and that often the vast majority improve in their living standards, and a bad climate for one civilization may not be a bad climate for another. So in the present moment, how do we put together these two dynamics that people say are independent, but we know are not. There's a crisis of life making, a crisis of climate, a state shift in the climate system, and a moment of mass extinction, which I think is a euphemism. I think that the crisis of biodiversity is a moment of mass extermination, and a crisis of profit making, marked by the end of cheap nature, which is not just the exhaustion of soils, the devastation of forests, but also the rise of new politics, of new ontological politics like food sovereignty, climate justice, and other movements that refuse a partial solution, which is a non-solution to the climate crisis. So, the geological Anthropocene and the geohistorical Capitalocene can coexist. Now we have to return to man and nature because this still remains extremely powerful. This is the iconic poster from the cartoonist Walt Kelly for the first Earth Day in 1970. We have met the enemy, and he is us. And this occurs at the very moment, this is the iconic photograph, of course, of the so-called napalm girl. So we have met the enemy and he is us. That kind of statement sits very uncomfortably with the reality of American terror bombing in Vietnam. Humans did it, right? We're destroying the earth. Well, the earth is going to be just fine. Whether we will is different. And so, of course, we are asking who is the we in these discussions. We are not all responsible for the violence and devastation of modernity. So when the scientist in when the scientist in that cartoon says we are destroying the planet, he's saying something totally reasonable and completely insane. On the one hand, yes, it is totally reasonable in the sense of the geological Anthropocene to explain a biophysical transformation in terms of a species acting. On the other hand, it says nothing about what really drives climate change, nothing about history, nothing about power. It is a profoundly limited reading of climate change as reduced to greenhouse gas molecules. So humans did it. This is a profoundly hopeless point of view. To say anthropogenic as a geohistorical claim, which is what it usually is, so it's different if you're writing in a scholarly journal as a scientist. But if you are writing this in the press, in the media, or as a historian, as a geographer, you are engaging in an ecology of hopelessness. I want to suggest that we need an ecology of hope. And that means that we ask, who's responsible? We know who is responsible for capitalogenic climate change. They have names, they have addresses. So, in order to get to an ecology of hope, rather than an ecology of hopelessness, we need to ask some big questions, including not just who is we, but how did we get here? This is a difficult question because environmentalist thought has been profoundly ahistorical. Oftentimes, almost as a reflex, we want to say, well, it all began with the Industrial Revolution. And it is true that the proximate source of climate crisis today is the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But remember, that is a reductionist perspective. We need to understand why those greenhouse gases were put into the atmosphere and how they are not just creating a climate crisis, but how they are bound with relations of power and accumulation and cultural hegemony that limit or seek to constrain our imaginaries for a post-capitalist, dare I say, socialist reconstruction in an era of climate crisis, which of course will not end with capitalism. The climate crisis will continue. So I think that we need to go back to the origins of the modern world, and we need to understand that that goes back to Columbus and the profound environment-making revolution of early capitalism, that is, of the 3 centuries after 1492. This is when the systems of domination, of money, of organizing world nature came into play. And the audacious achievement from the beginning was to bring together Pangaea, the great supercontinent that had broken apart in geological terms 175 million years ago, was to reestablish that through the invasion. And Mao once said political power comes from the barrel of a gun. But for capitalists, economic power always came from the barrel of a gun. So the reestablishment of a modern Pangaea, not just through capital, but through guns and through empires and through science, especially botany and cartography, greatly expanded the work and energy available for commodity production and exchange. So it made possible, it delivered huge amounts of cheap energy, labor, food, and raw materials, what I call the 4 cheaps to capitalists from the very beginning. Now this was tied to Columbus's experiences, not just when he came to the Americas, but as we tell in A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, that Columbus was enmeshed in a grand movement of reconquest. The invasion of the New World in 1492 was the last of 3 great ethnic cleansing campaigns. The first began in the 1470s with the reconquest of the Canary Islands, with the final conquest of the Canary Islands in the Atlantic. The second was in 1482 was the campaign against the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia, Granada. And Castile and Aragon, the kingdoms that unified to become modern Spain, could not pay for these invasions, for these ethnic cleansing campaigns. It had to borrow money. It borrowed money from the Genoese, from Genoa, from bankers that found their home in Genoa but were all over Iberia. Columbus was from Genoa. And the thing about war is that there were very few profitable products of the war, but there were slaves. And so from this process, from this movement of Reconquista that was an ethnic cleansing campaign from the beginning, we see how racism as coerced labor, as cheap labor, conquest, and credit all came together. This is a picture, a stylized painting, obviously from much later, of the fall of Malaga in 1487. Columbus was present at the fall of Malaga. And when the Castilians conquered Malaga, they sold every single one of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants into slavery. That's this picture. That is an enduring reality that has been reproduced many times over the next 3, 4, and indeed 5 centuries. So in the invasion of the New World that carried forth this trinity, this triple helix of conquest, credit, and coerced labor, was a profoundly genocidal effect. So it wasn't just virgin soil epidemics, that is, wasn't just the spread of disease as a somehow accidental phenomenon. This was driven by racism and the search for cheap labor in order to sustain a new kind of class dynamic and the principles of endless capital accumulation. So this gave rise to what the geographers Lewis and Maslin call the Orbis spike, or global spike. And you can see that red line spikes down sharply after 1550. Carbon dioxide parts per million fall by about 10 parts per million in just 50 years. That reinforces a dramatic a movement towards a cold climate beginning in the 1550s. This is the worst, the most inhospitable of the Little Ice Age in the long, cold 17th century. Now, that gives us a puzzle because this did not end capitalism. Severe ice ages had undermined feudal civilization, had undermined Roman civilization, but capitalism survives. Why? Because they can go to the frontier. And they can go, and the genius of European capitalism was to militarize and racialize capital accumulation in a way that organized commodity production, especially in sugar, but it's a much more complex story, but especially in sugar, could organize a grand movement towards the tropics. In essence, capitalism could escape the severe climate conditions of the North Atlantic by a grand movement towards the great frontier, which was overwhelmingly tropical. Even the North American colonies were either subtropical, as in the Carolinas, or as in New England, were completely oriented towards the British West Indies. So here you can see, this is the dynamic of capitalism. Capitalism does not begin in Europe, let me be clear. Capitalism emerges through the great frontier and this process of guns and ships and slavery, of world money, world power, and world nature in this dynamic and destructive combination. Here you can see the worst of winter severity in the 17th century, in this long, cold 17th century. And what I'm going to do is walk you through a very short causal sequence. And yes, this is crude, but there's something to this sequence. This is winter severity. This is the web, the global reach and global arc of rebellions and revolts, not just within Europe, as you can see, but all across the world. There was a period of profound political crisis all around the world at the heart of the long, cold 17th century between the 1630s and 1660s. This was the solution. Go to the frontiers, build global colonial empires. Empires had existed forever. Global empires based on the accumulation of capital were a completely new phenomenon. All right, so what about the Industrial Revolution? Is that unimportant? Well, no, not at all. But what do we mean by that? Usually, the story goes, and this is true for Marxists as well as for more mainstream historians, this is a story of England and a very intelligent Englishmen and coal and the steam engine. And the Marxists throw in and say, oh yes, well, the class struggle was central. There's a big surprise. Yes, of course, class struggle was central. Coal was important. Steam was important. All of that. But steam does not become central to English industry until 1830. And yes, there were class struggles in England that favored that, as Andreas Malm tells, in the mill towns that were powered by water mills. There was a profound revolt and unrest. But none of that matters if there is no cheap cotton. No, where is the cotton coming from? Well, first of all, we have to recognize that the cotton that was used had to be very strong cotton. It had to be cotton that could withstand machine working, machine spinning. So the cotton variety itself was the product of millennia of work done by indigenous peoples. And from what I can glean from the ethnographic histories, that work was overwhelmingly the work of women. So that's the cotton. The cotton gin is this machine you see in the lower left. The cotton gin was invented in the early 1790s. It extracted the seeds from the cotton, and it made labor productivity advance by 50 times. That is, one person could clean 50 pounds of cotton in a day instead of 1 pound of cotton in a day. And then finally, and not insignificantly, the indigenous peoples who had developed the cotton were then exterminated and expelled. So here we have this toxic brew of capitalism, as ever, of appropriating the unpaid work of indigenous peoples and then killing them and dispossessing them, of a racist labor system combined with an agricultural innovation in the countryside. So that was the decisive condition for the Industrial Revolution. And I know some people say, "Oh, you're not being a Marxist," but I say, "Aha." Marx says, this is a direct quote, "It was only the fall in the price of cotton that allowed for the rise of large-scale industry." So I don't think Marx was right about everything, but I think that we should be skeptical about people who say, you know, we know the truth. As it's not just Marxists who do this, there's many others as well. But of course, this was also a process of class struggle, that slaves revolted and rebelled in large ways and small ways. All right, so we're going to hold that in our head as we move into the last third or so of our talk. So why do we still think humanity is the cause of crisis, anthropogenic climate change? Well, it has to do with these two dynamics of man and nature and populationism. So we're going to go to the Anthropocene before the Anthropocene, which was in the 70s called Spaceship Earth. Oh, Spaceship Earth, that sounds nice. And this was very much, you know, where do you take a picture of the Earthrise? Well, you take it from a spaceship. That gives us a nice kind of techno-communist way of conceptualizing the environmental problem. And if only we all can organize the life support systems, water and air and all the rest, then everything will be okay. It's always very curious that those who talk about life support systems never talk about capital or power or the world color line or the world gender line or all of that. So when does this new global environmental imaginary, that is the direct predecessor of the Anthropocene, when does it emerge? It emerges in the world revolution of the long 1960s. In the 60s and 70s, global capitalism was challenged as never before. And it was under sustained and serious threat, both in the imperialist centers, but also across the colonial world. So Richard Nixon, the American president, Richard Nixon was a very savvy politician. He says, aha, the environment. We're going to get behind the environment. So he says in his second State of the Union address, he says, restoring nature to its natural state is a cause beyond party and beyond factions. This is a moment when the cities are in open revolt against the American federal government, when workers are refusing to go to work under terrible conditions. It is a moment where Nixon sends the National Guard to stop a strike of postal workers, and the National Guardsmen end up joining the striking postal workers. So Nixon says, oh, it's the environment. And of course, this is a photo of an American Huey helicopter over Vietnam spraying. What are they spraying here? Does anybody know? Yeah, Agent Orange, right? This is an act of chemical and biological warfare. Also, by the way, it is from the Vietnam War that we get the word ecocide from a journalist writing at that moment. So in 1968, something else is happening. This is the era of when Paul Ehrlich, and I'm sure a number of you are familiar with that name, publishes perhaps the most influential environmental text of all time, called The Population Bomb. It was called The Population Bomb because after the atomic bomb. But he almost called it Our Spaceship is Bursting. It's bursting with too many people. This is from the opening pages where Paul Ehrlich recounts a visit that he made to Delhi in 1965. And you can see just the racial anxiety dripping off the page. He says, you know, people were everywhere screaming, arguing, defecating, urinating, clinging to buses. People. It was dirty, it was noisy, it was hot. And this really sets the tone for the reinvention of Malthus in the late 1960s. Now, this is an important parallel because remember that Ehrlich publishes The Population Bomb in 1968 during a period of unprecedented revolt against capitalism. Thomas Malthus publishes the first essay on population in 1798, which is following the most rebellious and contentious and revolutionary 25 years in the history of capitalism to that point. The Irish Revolt in that year, but of course before that you have the Haitian, American, and French revolutions and many other rebellions and revolts from Peru to Russia and many places in between. So Malthus was an organic intellectual of the British Empire. He worked for the East India Company College. He was the first chair of political economy there. And so in the British imperial tradition, racism and overpopulation thinking and imperial rule went together. So, by the way, when Ehrlich goes to Delhi in 1965, about 2.5 million people lived there. 3 times as many people lived in London at the time. But London was not overpopulated because it was full of white people mostly. And that's not. I'm not just calling names here. The British Secretary for India during World War II later said that he saw no essential difference between the racial ideology of Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler. Winston Churchill, in the midst of the Bengal famine in 1943, refused offers of food relief from the Australians and from the Canadians. He said, they are beastly people with a beastly religion, and not to worry, they breed like rabbits. That's a direct quote, breed like rabbits. So again, we see the colonial impulse to reclassify human beings as outside of humanity. They're not humans, they're rabbits. So this leads to a different situation, a different time and place, where in part of what I do is a history of early capitalism that looks at the history of slavery and the slave trade. And one of the great autobiographies and accounts of the Middle Passage, that is those who were able to survive this long trip from Africa to North America in this instance, is the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano. And he published this account that looks very similar in a lot of ways to Ehrlich's. So he talks about how it was just full of these loathsome smells and the chains and the filth and the shrieking in horror. He says it was a scene of horror, almost unimaginable, inconceivable. And so there's this sense in which we understand the slave ship as a toxic brew of capitalism, empire, and racism. But somehow we don't see the so-called overpopulation of Delhi as a toxic brew of racism, imperialism, and capitalism. Somehow there is a movement where we see spaceship Earth and slave ships Earth as separate, but in fact the spaceship Earth is very much a slave ship Earth. Let's remember that there are more people in conditions of coercive work and outright slavery than there were even at the height of slavery. The United States prison industrial complex has effectively 2 million slaves who work at between 25 cents a day and maybe $1.50 under conditions of coercion. And if that's not slavery, I don't know what is. So if we begin to conceptualize the world not in terms of man and nature, but in terms of capitalocene and the tendency towards the climate class divide, climate patriarchy, climate apartheid, we begin to have a very different sense. If we say, no, it's not spaceship Earth, it's slave ship Earth, that's important. Now, you might be saying, well, isn't that hopeless? And I want to say, not at all. The slave ships were sites of profound struggle and resistance. As many as 500 recorded slave ship revolts, probably 5 times as many unrecorded. It was a grand class struggle that occurred in the boats from even before the moments of embarkation onto the boats all the way to the New World. So this gives us some different ways of looking at the question of man and nature and its fundamental populationism. As Julian Bond remarked, it is population thinking is a theoretical hammer in the hands of racists and an ultimate justification for genocide. Here is Ehrlich's book. I will note, if you look very closely above the words "the population bomb," you will see that this is a Sierra Club book. This represents, and Sierra Club was probably the best of the major environmental organizations in the United States. So this is a problem that the Sierra Club and big environmentalism has faced throughout, that it has been woefully complicit in white supremacism across this era. And when we look at the Anthropocene, we should see that as an updated version of this spaceship Earth, of this population bomb thinking, basically updated for 21st century white supremacism, market triumphalism, and the utopianism of the billionaire class that sees the anti-politics machine of the Anthropocene as a very positive force in distracting and undermining a radical alternative. So where are we? Well, we've come a long way. How do we move towards an ecology of hope? So first of all, let's remember climate change always destabilizes ruling classes. Climate changes are moments of political possibility. So here again, we have this account of geophysical change and geohistorical crisis. So that's a hopeful moment. Here, I'm going to skip ahead here. We can remember that these are moments of grand social revolt. Here's a picture of the Grand Jacquerie, or Great Peasant Revolt of 1358. And in the present moment, what do we see? First of all, there's a tendency to underestimate the degree of ferment and resistance around the world, that ruling classes rule until they don't. Ruling classes rule until they don't. And the changes that have occurred in the history of the past 5 centuries are quite dramatic. The French king ruled until he was imprisoned and beheaded. All right? So we know who is responsible for the injustices of the present moment, just as the Third Estate and the Jacobins understood who was responsible for organizing the oppressions of the Ancien Regime in 18th century France. So what we are seeing is the emergence of new alignments between environmental justice, feminist, anti-racist, labor, and other movements, indigenous movements especially. And I think what we are seeing is a way to come to grips politically with capitalism's sources of work. Now, the problem of environmentalism has been that it sees degradation as the central question. And degradation is there and real and palpable. But we also have to understand that what we are seeing is the exhaustion of capitalism's strategy of putting nature to work for free or very low cost. What this shows is that the zone of paid work of workers, of sharecroppers, of people working in the money economy depends on a much larger sphere of unpaid work, the unpaid work of human natures and the unpaid work of the web of life as a whole. In other words, every act of exploitation within the money economy depends on a larger act of appropriation of the unpaid work of women, nature, and colonies, to quote Maria Mies. So we are now living through a period of protracted revolts aboard spaceship Earth. And this requires a way of moving beyond the fundamental divide in world politics around the question of justice over the past 50 years, which is simply jobs or development or versus sustainability. These have to come together. And in order to do that, both a labor and socialist and Marxist politics of labor have to move beyond their labor fundamentalism. And the environmentalists have to stop pretending that work is something that is outside their concern. We have to be able to put together the questions of care work and social reproduction with labor politics, with the crisis of the biosphere. So understanding that capitalism is a system not just of degrading nature, but of putting webs of life to work, including human webs of life, is fundamental to that task. And so, okay, so what we want to do is to come to grips with a more relational, a radically relational view of the past 5 centuries, the past 12,000 years, in order to see the political possibilities of the present. We know what needs to be done. We know that the atmosphere has to be decarbonized. And we also know that that won't be done very, very rapidly. It's very difficult to do. We also know that decarbonization has to occur through democratization. It has to occur through decommodification. And it has to occur through a demilitarization of the world, and end especially to the United States' endless wars. So how will that be done? I think that we are, that how, I think everything turns on that, the answer to that question. Will we continue to hold to a labor fundamentalism and a nature fundamentalism, or will we look for a way in which the proletariat and the biotariat can come together? So for that, I would say that gives us some possibility of discussion and of unfolding an imagination that moves beyond man and nature. In other words, that moves beyond the thinking that created the crisis in the first place. Thank you very much.
Hacking questions, so probably sit here. Okay.
You have the hard work.
Before we start, I would like to express some words briefly. First of all, I'm very happy that we decided to use this place, this venue, for this fantastic and inspiring talk. It's not because of this is a splendid and gorgeous venue. That is because, from my point of view, the College of Social Sciences, in terms of physical space or in terms of organization and institution, it is always the base to spur critical and deep thinking in the campus or also for Taiwan society. And secondly, recently the mainstream for the scholarly work in Taiwan, and I think also all over the world, is to call for the balance between theory and action, the academics and the practices. But I found that mostly in fighting for the climate change or accommodating to climate change, we always blame ourselves, as Jason said, ask for ourselves, do by ourselves, but we forgot some theory thinking and theoric discussion. Particularly, I think I'm very happy because for this kind of discussion with the historical and planetary scale to discuss how we should act for or fight for the climate change, I think is quite rarely recently on the campus. So which is very important to me, and I'm also quite moody and touching about this. And thirdly, you know, as a geographer, I'm quite sensitive to the places, the atmosphere of the places. So even though this is a nice, you know, venue, but sometimes that will cool down the, you know, atmosphere for discussion. But it always depends on the participants. So I hope, you know, all the participants here can try to make this venue, you know, warm and hot interaction and discussion places. So we now can start to take questions, and feel free for the students, if you are not able to express your English fluently, you have help here. So try to, you know, catch the opportunities, okay? So any question that you would like to discuss or share with our speakers here, please. Okay, we have a student there, and she's from IPCS, the program I just told you earlier. Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm from the International Program of Climate Change and Sustainable Development. And I have a question about, thank you very much, because I think the capitalism and capitalism is a very interesting topic for the climate change research. And I have a question related to the human, about the demand of in the capitalism. It can be the driver of the climate change crisis. So I have a question that the change in some country and in some group like anti-marriage, anti-kids, the population aging which happen in Taiwan, if it can be seen as the solution for the planetary crisis or not. Thank you.
Can what be seen as the
It
solution?
can be seen as the solution for the planetary crisis.
But before then, what is the solution?
Okay, I will explain again. Okay, I mean the population increasing, it can see as the driver for the climate crisis.
Absolutely not. So rising population levels have nothing to do. I mean, it's a complicated question. If we mean in the abstract, which is how it's usually discussed, well, there are 7.7 billion people on the planet. That's a fact, but it's not a historical fact. It's not a geohistorical fact. It's just a piece of data. What does that mean? Now, under capitalist relations of population, then population has an impact overall, given the existing arrangement of production and reproduction, given the profound inequality in the world. Now, so that means, for instance, if one is born in the Sudan and one survives, one has virtually no contribution to climate change. If one is born in Sweden, one has a significantly larger contribution by virtue of being within relations of capitalist domination and capital accumulation. So population is not a standalone fact or variable. It only has meaning within relations of power and production and reproduction. But not only that, we have to be clear that overpopulation discourse over the past 50 years has always meant the overpopulation of people who don't look like me. It's always meant non-white people, too many brown people. That is what overpopulation has meant. And we have to be radically clear about that. That it is also a process of blaming the victim, which we know historically around women's domination, blaming women for the overpopulation problem. So much so that when Paul Ehrlich was writing in the United States and going around the country saying population is the main driver of environmental crisis, at a time when the United States was absolutely destroying Vietnam, not to mention other parts of the world, there were 13 states that were considering forced sterilization of poor women. So that's how dangerous this thinking is.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Particular students, if you think that we need to do some of the translation as a remark for you, just let us know. Yi and I can do that briefly. If you need, just, give us a hint right away. Okay? 刚刚的那个有需要帮你们翻译他的结论吗？ Okay, no. Okay.
Thank you, Professor, for your fascinating talk. So I'm an assistant professor in geography department, and also all my students here for your talk. So in the past months, we read Eric Wolf, Europe without history, Europe and the people without history. So it seems to me that there are some parallels between your arguments and Eric Wolf's book, but currently, apparently, I can also tell some difference between your argument and Wolf's argument. For example, like Wolf identified the beginning of capitalism in Europe, in England during the 18th century. But it seems to me that you cannot agree with this observation. So I'm curious if you can help me and my students here to make a kind of comparative analysis or a kind of theoretical clarification between your argument here and Wolf's Europe and the people without history. So sorry, so I just have to translate my question to my students. So 我请教老师是说，我们在之前的课程里面，我们有念那个欧洲跟没有历史的人啊。那这两位，这基本上都是用这个世界体系的一个观点来处理。比如说像是资本主义的问题，那如果同学还记得的话，在我们之前的课程里面，就是我们一直强调，就是 Wolf 他把资本主义的起源，他把它定在18世纪的英国。那显然老师的分析，他并没有把他的起点限制在，就是它是一个资本主义体系的分析，可是它的起点不是在那里。所以我刚刚就请教老师说，这两个东西的差别到底在哪里？到底这个资本主义它的起源到底在哪里？它对于整个世界体系的改变，那一个起点到底我们要怎么去做那个区分？这样子。
It's a great question. I like Eric Wolf's book quite a lot. It is one of the most, not just Eurocentric, but Anglo-centric visions of capitalism that one can possibly imagine. To think that modern slavery is somehow a pre-capitalist relation ignores entirely the webs of fundamental qualitative transformations in money, world power, and world nature, and how all of those were fit together in a new environment making pattern. I would point out that the scholar that he relies on to say, well, it all began in England, is Robert Brenner. And even Bob doesn't think the first agricultural revolution was in England anymore. It was clearly within Europe in the Dutch Republic, as Brenner has shown, as many other fine Dutch historians have shown. And then there was an agricultural revolution in the colonies too, the sugar plantation revolution. And so there is a double problem with, or maybe a triple problem with Wolf. One is the Anglocentrism. Enough with it all began in England, just enough. And then there is a problem of Marxist formalism. So that is, we are going to define capitalism in terms of certain formal categories, formal criteria, and then go out into the world and see if it exists, which is the exact opposite of the ethnographic imagination that that Woolf pioneered, and the kind of Marxist ethnography that he showed in, say, Peasant Wars. And then there's an inability to conceptualize the centrality of imperialism to capitalist development and the ways that imperialism functions in order to put humans and the rest of nature to work as cheaply as possible. That is, the centrality of imperialism in capitalism as a system of cheap nature.
So would you please kind of translate a little bit, to the student? Why I ask for this, because this is also echo to my second point. Would you please just allow me to express in Mandarin? 我刚刚第二点特别有提到，就是说，其实我们现在比较深度的跟历史性的阅读，我觉得在校园里的环境里面其实是越来越少。好，所以今天这样的一个演讲，其实虽然比较难，但是其实是一个比较深度的历史性的全球性的纵贯的思考。但是因为这方面的讨论跟训练的障碍度其实也蛮高的哈，所以我为什么还是刚好洪广基老师也在教授我们的这个地理思想的课程，那所以他有带学生来，那他问的问题，我也觉得这个Jason 的回答，或许广基老师可以再简单的用中文跟大家说明一下，这样子也可以让我们的同学，我想这边还有一堆其他系所的这个同学。可以更了解这个回答，你要回答
帮忙，不是就是翻译的话，然后广基老师，
因
为我其实刚刚有想说，是不是因为广基老师如果有英文演讲，都会替那个讲完之后做一个中文总结，但是因为 Jason 这个演讲要做中文总结，我觉得大家还是去读他中文翻译书，可能是会比较完整。但是刚刚的回答可以简单讲一下，就是。刚刚广基老师问到这个 Eric Wolf 对于整个资本主义的起源，事实上是有一些类似的，但是又是有差异的视野。那Jason 的回应是说，他认为当然 Eric Wolf 对于这个资本主义起源的这个看法呢，是一个这本书是一个很好的书，但是它是一个非常欧洲中心的视野，甚至是一个英格兰中心的视野。为什么这样说？因为他把资本主义的起源完全是放置在英格兰，在这个而且呢，具有一种就是马克思主义的这个 formalism 的一个做法，就是去看到前资本主义的生产模式怎么样转变到资本主义的生产模式，但是它完全是集中在英格兰。因此呢，他没有看到的是说，在同一个时期，在荷兰 Dutch 的 colony 荷兰的殖民地，事实上同时在进行着这个可以说转换的这个生产模式的问题。所以如果说是要有一个critique 的话，它可能是一个有关就是怎么样把这个殖民主义以及这个帝国扩张的这个问题同时放进来资本主义起源的探讨。但是广基老师可以。
广基老师要不要再补充？对，或者是我们先，你要好。
同学可以了解吗？就是这个彼此之间的差异，因为我刚刚的问题啦，就是它其实是一个3阶段的一个辩论，因为Wolf 他在欧洲没有历史的人里面，他会很清楚的把资本主义把它定义在是18或19世纪的英格兰，是因为他要跟之前的世界体系理论，就是这一些像华勒斯坦啊、弗兰克这一些人去做对话。那他反对的是说，你把什么东西各式各样的生产跟交换，全部都把它丢到资本主义里面去。所以这一些世界体系理论，它可能就是把资本主义的历史拉得非常非常的长。但是沃夫他说，我们要谈资本主义，我们就有一个很清楚的一个定义。所以他讲的基本上就我们上课讲的那一些，你基本上你要有一个经过一个原始积累的过程以后，你这个工厂生产工具被集中在资本家的手里，然后人民失去资本工具、生产工具，然后你变成在工厂里面工作的人嘛，你靠卖你的劳动力变成是一个无产的劳工嘛。 所以他是在这个基础上把资本主义很清楚的定义之后，然后他再去探讨说，这个资本主义在扩张的过程中，它跟其他的生产模式产生什么样一个 articulation 嘛，就是勾连嘛。所以你透过这样子一个处理的方法，你把过去这一些被视为等待被征服、等待被消灭的这一些没有历史的人，在这个过程中，因为透过跟资本主义的勾连，反而你产生出来的一种独特的历史。这个历史它既不是资本主义的历史，它也不是一个等待被消灭的历史，这是沃夫的讲法。但是老师他就会认为是说，这样说也是有道理的啦，就是你把资本主义都把它当成它是一个欧洲的产物，甚至更线索一点，它是一个英国的产物。所以这样子一个讲法，实际上是你忽略了，其实在同样一个时期里面，其实在很多的地区很多地区都有类似的事情在发生，只是刚好基于某种理由，我们上课也有强调这种随机性，就是英国的资本主义这一些资本家可能好运，结果他长出了一套体系出来，那一套体系就刚好成为我们现在的资本主义体系。但是我刚刚的老师说的就是说，我们其实也要避免这一种你在诉诸一个事情，不管它是好是坏，但是你去诉诸它是从一个地方单一的起源，然后那个东西它好厉害，或者说好邪恶，可是它征服了整个世界之类的。所以这就是老师要提醒我们去思考的，因为这个也会牵涉到我们上课都有会去批评到，它会掉进去一种直线的、有目的的、演化的、进步的这样子一个历史的观点。那老师要讲的就是，你可能是在不同区域里面交织互动，在这个 relational 的这个过程中产生出来有一个体系，我们叫做资本主义，如此而已，可以吗？可以哦，好。
Okay, for those you have read, Jason's works, do any of you have some, questions or feedback want to, share with us?
Thank you, Dr. Moore. I cannot agree with you more with everything you said. Just say, however, I'm thinking about one question. Maybe it's also my personal question that somehow we feel like we criticize or we bring everything to the capitalism, for example, the people with power, and it seems like we still have imagination that the normal savage, like people without capital or power, they won't ruin the environment, something like that. For example, I'm thinking about an example from East Island. East Islanders, they cut down the trees and ruin all their life, even before the capitalism. So I wonder, we also always have a dualism, like capitalism, capital or power ruin the environment, and however, people without capital or power, they still keep innocent and keep very harmonious relationship with the environment, something like that. Do you think we have any kind of bias when we talk about this kind of criticism against capitalism?
Well, so the Easter Island story became a kind of iconic story of man and nature, and popularized by very influential texts by people like Jared Diamond and Clive Ponting. And now, let's say 25 years of anthropologists especially have pointed out that virtually everything about those stories by Diamond and Ponting is incorrect. In fact, people still live on Easter Island, and so the dynamics of Easter Island itself are in question. Now, the other question is something that is hugely important, so I'm so glad that you brought it up, which is, of course, pre-capitalist civilizations significantly transformed their environments. But they did so over centuries. So in medieval Europe, for instance, which was a very tightly organized class structure, but we could tell a similar story of, say, Song China. That, yes, there was a dynamic of what I would call settlement resource expansion. So under those class relations, population growth tended to push some new people out into new zones of settlement and cultivation. And from there, commerce and resource extraction would follow. And that process would unfold typically over very long periods of time. In capitalism, that relationship is completely inverted. That commerce and commodification go first. So the sugar plantation is a great example of that. And then people are reorganized in service to commodity production and capital accumulation. And so often in some of these talks, I give an instructive contrast between medieval Europe, which was one kind of class society, or class civilization, and capitalist Europe. In medieval Europe, in feudal Europe, in northeastern France, in the 12th and 13th centuries, 12,000 hectares of forests were cleared in 200 years. In the 1650s, at the height of northeastern Brazil's sugar boom, so the sugar plantations, 12,000 hectares of forests were cleared in 1 year. So there is, of course, there is a longer history of the Holocene and of civilization and of agriculture that we all belong to in one way or another. That shouldn't distract us from the extraordinary rupture in the scale and the scope and the speed of environment making in the early modern century, so between 1492 and 1792, long before the steam engine. And the steam engine ultimately revolutionizes the world not through the industrial factory, but through the railroad and the steamship. I mean, think of today the container ship, but before the container ship was the steamship and the revolutionizing of planetary life by capitalism in the later 19th century. So I think that we should say, yes, there are tendencies of all class formations, of all class societies towards environmental transformation. But that's very different from saying that there is some inherent conflict between man and nature, which is not at all what you're saying, I recognize. But we also need to be aware, as I know a number of us are ethnographers or anthropologists here, that the stories of the modern world that we accept as true are powerful material forces. So the Easter Island story has been a powerful myth in the double sense, both a myth that many of us have accepted until we've learned differently, and a myth that organizes our understanding of life. So that would be a beginning to a response. It's a very important question. I'm so glad you asked it.
Would you please make some short remark in Chinese?
刚刚这个何采娜老师问了这个问题，就是说，我们是不是如果去指出资本主义在整个生态危机的重要位置，似乎是在另外一个层面上会有一个有关这个高贵的野蛮人这样子的想象，就说那非资本主义或者前资本主义的生产模式是不是好像把它美化了？那 Jason 的这个回应是说。对于这个有关这个 noble savage 就是高贵野蛮人这样的形象，事实上呢，是源自于有关 Eastern Island， 就是这个有一个Jerry Diamond 他的这样子的一个描述，似乎说有一种前资本主义的文明形式，但是事实上这样子的所谓的非资本主义的这个样子的一个生产模式，它同时也是一个很动态的模式，它还跟这个 settlement 就是移居者之间都有长期的一个互动的关系，所以并没有在历史上的确真实的这样子完全是孤立的所谓的 noble savage， 完全是跟世界没有接触这样子的概念，基本上是一个迷思。那他就更提到了，就是说另外一个可以我们的思想资源是有关这个中世纪的欧洲。也就是我们常常会认为是一个封建时期的欧洲，但是所谓的封建时期的欧洲12、13时期的欧洲呢，它当时就存在的所谓的这个商业以及这个 commodity 就是商品，那这样子的这个形式先来了，然后到1650年代的时候开始出现了蒸汽机，那蒸汽机怎么样子去改变了在这个铁路以及这个蒸汽船上面 的这个在运输上面对于资本主义产生很大的帮助，所以事实上这是一个很动态的一个历史过程，并没有说有办法这样子，我们好像说认为说那有一个前资本主义的这样子的生产模式似乎是对于所谓的生态危机是有一个可能性，至少是不是这样子的一个态度。
We are very lucky to have Yi to help. So feel free, students, if you have any question. 有没有什么问题啊？Please.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. According to your idea, which I pretty agree about, as a campaigner, I wondered what kind of framework shift or adjustment should be made if we want to integrate this idea into current global climate governance system, which is UN-based, state-centric, UNFCCC system. Thank you.
There we go. So what's the solution to the climate crisis? Or how, I think climate justice at its best insists on a different imagination for what we call growth and development. So it insists on a vision of decarbonization through democratization and decommodification. How do we do that? One opening that is, because politics are always problematic, but one opening that is hopeful is, for instance, in the United States, is the discussion of a Green New Deal. Now, politics is very messy, and we shouldn't make too much of it because there are lots of problems with it. But here's a political moment where the question of climate crisis and the crisis of livelihood, the crisis of unemployment and poverty are coming together. The weak point of that argument is that it still embraces a capitalist conception of the growth imperative. So we have to challenge that growth imperative and that growth metric, the ways of conceptualizing economic growth. And that's going to be difficult. I think that ultimately fundamental changes don't occur simply because movements organize effectively. The history of major social revolutions and of major political changes is one in which there are the contradictions of power and the contradictions of capital are operating simultaneously with forces of resistance. So you're right that the state-centric UN model doesn't work. Indeed, I wouldn't even call it a model of climate governance. I mean, the real climate model of governance is Goldman Sachs, is the New York, London, throw in your other favorite cities financial network. That's what's really driving the whole process. And then also there's the question of that's related to the fracturing of the world into states and the inequality between them. There's also the question of world money. So as long as the dollar retains its seigniorage capacity, that is, it functions as a world reserve currency, then we are locked into hothouse Earth. So I think my response says that we have to think about questions of political economy and the contradictions of capital as central to this process. It's not just a political process. And that we have to look for Green New Deal type solutions that are premised on, not on growth, but on decarbonizing, democratizing, and decommodifying simultaneously. And that's going to be a challenge. And then we have to be ready for the big moments of political crisis, because there will be big moments of political crisis in places across the world in which it will be possible to create a different kind of model around the unfolding climate crisis.
回应。
What's the role or what's the place of Asia or maybe Taiwan in its historical economical development process if we discuss this according to the narrative presented today?
Well, insofar as the center of world industrialization and not yet the center of world accumulation, but that may be in process as well, is moving to East Asia, then it poses fundamental questions about the whole political basis of power, which relies on endless economic growth. I mean, centrally, that relationship has to be questioned between political legitimacy and economic growth, which doesn't mean the end of growth. So I disagree with degrowth, because I think that we need something that says a growth in or an improvement in livelihood and well-being and all of that. But that is completely separate from gross domestic product figures and economic estimates. So we have to have a different calculus, a different economic calculus for understanding all of these processes, which systematically exclude the work of women, nature, and colonies. So the economics profession as well has to be confronted as driving the problem as well.
I think this is not too difficult, so I don't think we need to translate. I saw that there's a question from Professor Liu.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. And I have two little small questions asking for a clarification. The first one is, because I haven't read your book, so my first question is, obviously I pick up a lot of conceptual and theoretical elements from your talk, from like political ecology or ecological Marxism. So I'm wondering, is your work a new application of these two branches of scholarship on the world environmental history, or you have gone beyond these two branches of scholar, and what are those? That's the first question. And the second question is, maybe I was mistaken, but from what I heard from your talk, it seems your notion of capitalism is much broader than the typical Marxism would take it. For example, you would say there are already capitalist elements in the feudal era, and it seems to me the way you talk about capitalism is closer to Bourdieu, but your critique of capitalism is purely Marxist. So I'm wondering, did I understand your work wrong, or? Yes, that'll be all.
Well, those are great questions, and let me try to answer them in reverse order. That capitalism is a system of endless accumulation, and that has a geopolitical moment which looks like endless military competition, which involves endless borrowing of money. So the great military revolution of early modern Europe, which involved the tenfold expansion in the size of armies, the size of navies, and probably the 20-fold increase in the costs of waging wars was all there, all decisive to the development of capital accumulation in this period. But as a geographer, what I look at is the great environment-making revolution of these centuries, where from Southeast Asia to the Baltic, to northeastern Brazil, to Angola and the Congo, to the Andes in colonial Peru, the West Indies, you have this extraordinary environment-making revolution. So the endless accumulation of capital implies the endless geographical transformation of the earth. So in that, there are clearly many influences that you have detected. Whether it's purely Marxist or not remains to be seen, since many Marxists these days have squarely denounced me as not only a Marxist, but as John Bellamy Foster says, a friend of the climate deniers. So you can make up your mind as to how Marxist that is or not. For me, the question of Marx and Marxism is a question of dialectics and relations. It is a question of what Bertel Ullmann famously calls the philosophy of internal relations. And then world ecology is an effort to take that seriously, building not just on the so-called ecological Marx, but also on the dialectical Marx, to write stories of the modern world. So that incorporates environmental history, economic history, political ecology, women's history and feminist Marxism, anti-colonial and black Marxism. World ecology is, I call it, a conversation that is radically and relentlessly heterodox. Whether it's Marxist or not is of no concern to me whatsoever. Whether it is a conversation that generates useful, radical knowledge to understand the realities of the present moment and to inform revolutionary struggles seems to me what is really important. So is it useful, does it work or not? So eco-Marxism is a very peculiar kind of field that I learned a lot from, and that has, I would not consider myself an eco-Marxist, although I am a kind of Marxist. I'm a historian, I'm a feminist, I'm an anti-imperialist. So I wouldn't consider world ecology any more eco-Marxist than it is feminist Marxist. And indeed, for me, the decisive question was to do something that was pointed at by earlier Marxists around the question of nature, like Carolyn Merchant, Donna Haraway, historians influenced by Marxism like Don Worster. I'm forgetting some important people, but very much influenced by a kind of ethnographic sensibility of capitalism as a whole. And so not just Marxism, but many theoretical traditions have the problem of what I have called formalism. And so I often say, I was saying in a conversation before we began, if you have a theory, it can be very difficult to change your theory. But if you have an idea, you know it works or it doesn't work, and you can evolve your idea. You can change your idea. So that, for me, is the essence of what Marx shows for us, since Marx was relentlessly curious, and he wasn't afraid to just move on and revise his formulations. Famously, in his discussions around the peasant communes in Russia and the Mir and the possibility of a direct transition to communism, which was ultimately, really speculative and not very realistic, but shows the sort of flexibility in a dialectical imagination. So I think that would be my answer to say yes and to most of your questions there, Brodel and eco-Marxism and all the rest.
同学把你的两个问题简单的，不要吗？或请意义你再简述一下刘老师的问题，因为其实这两个问题也是我自己本来想问的问题啊。But just very quick, and then you can think of some other questions here.
刘老师刚刚问的两个问题，其实是有点关联的嘛，就是他们就是对。
个问题是，就是说，在那个 Professor Jason Moore 的 talk 里面，我 pick up 很多理论元素是从 political ecology 和政治生态学和从生态马克思主义来的。那我问他说，他的这个作品是利用这两种 approach 去研究世界环境史呢，还是说他的作品本身有超越这两个 branch 的 scholarship？ 然后第二个问题是问说，Professor Moore 的他所谈的那个资本的力量或者是资本主义，似乎涵盖非常非常的广，然后连我们一般在谈的封建时期都有所谓的资本主义的力量和元素。所以我问他他所谈的资本主义是不是比较接近法国年鉴学派的 Brodel 所谈的那种资本主义？可是他对于可是他自己的作品对于资本主义的批评又是纯马克思主义的。所以说这两者之间，就是我问他我有没有读错这样子。
是蛮重要的问题，所以请刘老师再重述一下。那因为我们大概还剩下7分钟哈，所以我们再拿譬如说1、2个问题。那杜文丽老师有问题哈。
Thank you, Professor Moore. And I think my question is because you mentioned in your talk about how capitalism affect the climate governance, and I'm just thinking because you just came here from China and you visit Beijing, and I bet that you noticed that there's a trade war between China and United States. And so my question is, how do you think about the Chinese capitalism, and I think that's somewhat different from U.S. capitalism, and how it affect the climate governance, or how Chinese capital play the role in today's world? It's probably
well, I wouldn't. I'm so glad you asked that question. I don't think the trade war can go very far, because both parties need the dollar to remain the world reserves currency. And I think we're going to have to wait, I don't think it would be that long, for the next major financial crisis, in which case the power of the dollar hegemony will be in question. And then I think we might see waves of more serious economic instability. Now, in terms of the carbonization of the atmosphere, that's probably a good thing. And in terms of political crises, any political instability within reason, so there are exceptions to what I'm saying, that might bring into question business as usual, both politics as usual, economics as usual, and all the rest, is a good thing. I mean, the history of China is quite fascinating, because there are two profoundly contrasting experiences. One is, for all its problems, the extraordinary accomplishments of the Chinese Revolution in improving the livelihoods and just lifespans of human beings. I don't think that that's ever been, the average lifespan of China goes from about 40 to about 62 between 1950 and 1970. 71, 72. I don't think that's ever been achieved in anywhere ever. So that's extraordinary. The Chinese Red Revolution in agriculture was just as productive as the Green Revolution model. It was, yes, fertilizer intensive, but generally not as toxic, and certainly favored peasant livelihoods in a way that does not fit with the Green Revolution across South Asia. But then on the other hand, we have the extraordinarily rapid development of capitalism in a sort of different way after, 79 or sometime in the 80s, where you have 200 to 300 million peasants just moved off the land almost overnight. That too is absolutely unprecedented and unthinkable. I wonder if maybe there is a moment, without being romantic about it, because we should always be critical, at which we could imagine a rapid redeployment of state power to decarbonize. And I think that some elements of decarbonization, a radical strategy, will involve community organized processes, mutual aid, as the anarchists would say. And I think there are a lot of elements that will need to follow from that principle. I think that looking at the experience, not just of China, but also of the Soviet Union, you have cases, you have national experiences of desperately poor countries that were more or less completely destroyed by war. And organized reconstruction projects that improve the livelihoods of the vast majority in those countries. Now, yes, there were many mistakes and many problems. But it seems to me that in an era of climate crisis, where we are already witnessing the extraordinary power of the geophysical moment of climate change and coming in and destroying just whole regions. We see this from Bangladesh to Puerto Rico. That maybe there are lessons to be drawn from that experience of a what I would call a reconstruction ecology, of socialist reconstruction, but not taking that as a model, but taking elements or lessons from those experiences. It's a thought.
Okay, because we only have 2 minutes left, so even though this is just a short discussion, but you kind of can tell what's people interested. So do you want to make a final remark to highlight some part of your several books that might be, can be used as, your responses to their question, and they can pay more attention to spend time to read it carefully?
I think I can say it very simply. I think that when we are students, and this is true for us as professors when we do the research to earn a PhD, we are given boxes. Maybe they're theories, maybe they're models, and we are told to fill in the theory. We are told to fill in the boxes with facts, with evidence. And what we need in this moment is to connect. We need to think beyond the boxes, and we need to look for new connections. And instead of building new boxes, we need to build new ways of telling stories about the world that are fundamentally connective between humans and the rest of nature, between economics and culture, between gender, race, and class. All of these big questions that we all encounter, and so often we look for the answer, and the answer is always a box. If it's the answer, it's always the box. We need to go beyond those boxes, and we need to be connective at every point. And if we have a theory that doesn't work, we should say it doesn't work. Let's try something different. And let me tell you, the world is full of professors who defend their theories even though it doesn't work. And so that goes for this audience here. And if you see, well, Moore's theory doesn't work, then you should say that. And we should develop an alternative and be open to that.
Just out of box, but try to be critical to his work, okay? Thank you very much. Thanks for all your participation. Thank you.